In the heart of New York City stands one of the largest metropolitan zoos in the world. 265 acres of carefully designed habitats, over 4,000 animals, and more than 2 million visitors every year. This is the Bronx Zoo, a place where families spend Sunday afternoons watching elephants and tigers, where children learn about conservation, and where scientists work to save endangered species from extinction. But behind the modern exhibits and educational programs lies a history that most visitors never see. A history shaped by wealthy industrialists, ambitious scientists, and deeply troubling beliefs about race and human nature. This is the dark story of how one of America's most beloved institutions was built on foundations we would rather forget. If you find this kind of deep historical investigation valuable, please consider subscribing and leaving a comment about which institution you would like me to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. The story begins not with animals, but with men. Wealthy, powerful men who gathered in the exclusive clubs of New York City during the final years of the 19th century. Men whose names appeared on hospital wings and university buildings. Men who believed they were saving America from itself. In 1895, a group of these men gathered to form the New York Zoological Society. Their stated purpose was noble enough. They wanted to establish a zoo that would preserve vanishing wildlife and promote the scientific study of animals. Among their founders were some of the most prominent figures in American society. Andrew Carnegie, the steel magnate whose wealth was measured in hundreds of millions. Theodore Roosevelt, the ambitious politician who would soon become president, and Madison Grant, a lawyer who would become one of the most influential and controversial figures in American history. Grant was a product of old New York money. Born in 1865 to a family whose wealth came from banking and medicine, he grew up surrounded by privilege. Yale-educated, Columbia law degree, member of all the right clubs. By the standards of his time and class, he had achieved everything a young American gentleman could want. But Grant harbored anxieties that no amount of wealth could cure. He watched as waves of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe arrived at Ellis Island. He saw neighborhoods transform. He heard unfamiliar languages on streets his grandfather had walked. And he became convinced that America itself was in danger. Not from foreign armies or economic collapse, but from what he called racial contamination. These beliefs shaped everything Grant did. His passion for conservation was genuine, but it was intertwined with darker impulses. He saw protecting wildlife and protecting what he called the Nordic race as essentially the same project. Both involved preserving pure types from degradation. Both required the intervention of superior men who understood what ordinary people could not. Both demanded the exclusion of what he considered inferior specimens. Grant drafted the legislation that created the New York Zoological Society. He designed its governance structure. He selected its first officers. And he ensured that it would serve not just as a zoo, but as a platform for his particular vision of science and society. The man Grant chose to run the new zoo was William Temple Hornaday, a taxidermist turned conservationist. Hornaday shared Grant's passion for wildlife and his prejudices about human beings. Born in Indiana in 1854, Hornaday had spent his youth hunting and collecting animal specimens. He had traveled the world acquiring creatures from museums and private collections, and he had witnessed something that changed him forever. In 1886, Hornaday traveled to Montana to collect bison specimens for the Smithsonian. What he found horrified him. The great herds that had once numbered in the tens of millions were nearly gone. Skeletal remains littered the plains. The few surviving animals were scattered and hunted. Hornaday realized he was witnessing the death of a species, and he resolved to prevent such destruction from happening again. This experience transformed Hornaday from hunter to conservationist, but it did not change his views about human society. Like Grant, Hornaday believed in a strict hierarchy of races and peoples. He despised immigrants, Native Americans, and anyone he considered inferior. He once wrote that Italian laborers were like human mongooses toward wildlife. He advocated for excluding non-white and non-Nordic peoples from America entirely. These two men, Grant and Hornaday, would shape the Bronx Zoo for its first 3 decades. Their conservation achievements were genuine. The zoo they built was revolutionary in its design and purpose, but their beliefs about human beings would lead to one of the most shameful episodes in American institutional history. The New York Zoological Park, as it was officially called, opened on November 8, 1899. From its first day, it was unlike any zoo that had come before. Most zoos of the era were essentially menageries. Animals lived in cramped cages, often concrete boxes barely larger than the creatures themselves. Visitors walked along narrow paths, peering through bars at miserable specimens pacing back and forth in their confinement. Education was an afterthought. Entertainment was the primary goal. Hornaday and Grant had something different in mind. They acquired 265 acres of land in the Bronx, a tract that included forests, meadows, and a river running through its center. Rather than force animals into identical cages, they designed exhibits that mimicked natural habitats. Bears had room to roam. Deer grazed in open spaces. Birds flew in large aviaries rather than sitting in tiny cages. The zoo's architecture reflected its ambitions. Beautiful Beaux-Arts buildings designed by the firm of Hines and Lafarge gave the grounds an air of permanence and importance. The Rockefeller Fountain, relocated from another site, provided an elegant centerpiece. Everything about the physical space proclaimed that this was a serious institution worthy of respect. Equally revolutionary was the zoo's educational mission. Unlike other zoos that required visitors to purchase guidebooks to identify animals, the Bronx Zoo featured informative signs throughout the grounds. Maps were freely available. The zoo organized lectures and programs designed to teach visitors about wildlife and conservation. The goal was not merely to display exotic creatures, but to cultivate understanding and appreciation. On opening day, 843 animals representing 267 species greeted visitors. Within 10 years, nearly 4 million people had passed through the gates. The zoo was a smashing success, and it immediately became one of New York's most popular attractions. The bison exhibit was particularly popular. Hornaday had made saving the American bison his personal crusade. When he conducted a census in 1889, he found only 1,091 bison remaining in the entire world. A species that once numbered in the tens of millions had been driven to the edge of extinction by systematic slaughter. At the Bronx Zoo, Hornaday acquired bison from ranches across the country and established a breeding program. By 1903, 40 bison roamed a special 10-acre enclosure. Visitors who had only seen bison in pictures or read about them in books could now observe living animals. More importantly, the zoo became the center of a restoration effort. In 1905, Hornaday and Grant joined with Theodore Roosevelt to form the American Bison Society. Roosevelt became honorary president, lending his prestige and political connections to the cause. 2 years later, 15 bison raised at the Bronx Zoo were shipped by rail to the Wichita Mountains Wildlife Refuge in Oklahoma. This was the first animal reintroduction in North American history. For the first time, a species that had been pushed to the brink of extinction was deliberately returned to its native habitat. The bison would survive. Today, approximately 350,000 bison live in North America, many of them descended from those Bronx Zoo animals. The bison restoration stands as one of the great conservation achievements of the early 20th century. It demonstrated that humans could save species, not just destroy them. It created a model that wildlife managers would follow for decades. And it cemented the Bronx Zoo's reputation as a leader in conservation science. Yet even this achievement was not entirely what it seemed. Hornaday and Grant saw bison conservation through the lens of their racial ideology. They believed they were saving a noble American species from the depredations of inferior peoples. Hornaday blamed Native Americans equally with white market hunters for the bison's decline. Despite clear evidence that indigenous peoples had lived sustainably with bison for thousands of years, the same paternalistic assumptions that shaped their views on race shaped their approach to conservation. The zoo's early years established patterns that would persist for decades. Genuine scientific achievement mixed with troubling ideology. Innovative approaches to animal welfare coexisted with profound blindness about human dignity. The institution that would become one of America's most visited and respected zoos was built on foundations that were both impressive and deeply flawed. Before we turn to the zoo's darkest chapter, we must acknowledge another story that often goes untold. The story of the people who actually built and maintained the Bronx Zoo. Not the wealthy benefactors whose names appeared on buildings. Not the scientists who claimed credit for discoveries, but the workers whose labor made everything else possible. Building the zoo required years of backbreaking work. The 265 acres that became the zoological park were not a blank canvas. They were rough, unimproved, land that needed extensive preparation. Forests had to be cleared in some areas and preserved in others. Ponds were dug, roads were laid, buildings rose from foundations poured by hand. The workers who did this labor were largely invisible in official accounts. They included recent immigrants from Ireland and Italy, the very groups that men like Grant despised. They included black laborers who had migrated north seeking better opportunities. They included craftsmen whose skills made possible the elegant Beaux-Arts architecture that visitors admired. These workers faced dangerous conditions. Construction in the late 19th century was hazardous work. Falls from scaffolding, injuries from heavy equipment, accidents with animals. The exact toll is impossible to calculate because records from that era rarely tracked worker injuries in detail. But men certainly suffered and died building the zoo that Grant and Hornaday would take credit for creating. Once the zoo opened, a different workforce kept it running. Keepers who fed animals and cleaned enclosures. Groundskeepers who maintained the carefully designed landscapes. Kitchen staff who prepared food for both animals and visitors. Security guards who patrolled at night. The daily functioning of the zoo depended on hundreds of workers, most of them earning modest wages while the wealthy founders received accolades. This pattern was standard for institutions of the era. Great museums, universities, and cultural institutions were all built and maintained by working people who rarely received recognition. The gap between those who owned and directed these institutions and those who labored in them was enormous. Social reformers of the period wrote about the contradictions of Gilded Age America, where unprecedented wealth existed alongside grinding poverty. The zoo embodied these contradictions as much as any factory or tenement. What makes this relevant to our story is the way that labor shaped how men like Grant and Hornaday saw the world. They believed in hierarchy. They believed that some people were naturally suited to command and others to serve. They believed that civilization depended on maintaining proper distinctions between superior and inferior types. These beliefs informed their conservation work as much as their racial ideology. When they looked at wildlife, they saw noble specimens that deserved protection and degraded creatures that could be sacrificed. When they looked at human society, they saw essentially the same hierarchy. The workers who built their zoo were as invisible to them as the laborers who cut stone and laid bricks. This context helps explain how Grant and Hornaday could commit the acts we are about to describe. They were not aberrant individuals acting against the values of their time. They were products of a system that routinely dehumanized working people, immigrants, and people of color. The cage in the monkey house was an extreme expression of assumptions that pervaded American society. To understand what happened at the Bronx Zoo in 1906, we must first understand the broader context of how Americans thought about race and human difference in that era. The 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis was the largest international exposition ever held in the United States. Nearly 20 million visitors came to see the latest technological wonders, artistic achievements, and scientific advances. They marveled at the Ferris wheel, sampled the ice cream cone for the first time, and witnessed demonstrations of the newly invented X-ray machine. But among the fair's most popular attractions were what organizers called living exhibits. These were displays of indigenous peoples from around the world, brought to St. Louis and placed in reconstructed villages where fairgoers could observe them like exotic animals. The scale of these human exhibits was staggering. The fair's anthropology department, headed by William John McGee, arranged for more than 10,000 people to be transported to St. Louis from across the globe. McGee declared that his aim was to present human progress from the dark prime to the highest enlightenment, from savagery to civic organization. The exhibits were designed to demonstrate what scientists of the era believed about racial hierarchy. Ainu people from Japan were brought to St. Louis. Indigenous groups from Patagonia crossed oceans to be displayed. Members of more than 50 Native American nations participated, including legendary figures like Geronimo and Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce. The Apache leader Geronimo was assigned to pose for photographs that sold for a nickel each. He was forced to play the role of the Sioux leader Sitting Bull in daily reenactments of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, a spectacle designed for white entertainment. The Philippine Reservation was among the largest and most popular exhibits. It occupied 47 acres and housed more than 1,000 Filipino people from different ethnic groups. The United States had recently acquired the Philippines after the Spanish-American War, and the exhibit was designed to demonstrate the supposed benefits of American colonial rule. Filipino peoples were forced to live in reconstructed villages, wearing traditional dress and performing ceremonies for visitors. Some groups were made to slaughter and eat dogs as part of their daily routine, satisfying American curiosity about exotic customs. Scientists measured their bodies and classified them according to racial categories. A mock battle between Filipino insurgents and American soldiers was staged regularly, reenacting the ongoing colonial war in ways that celebrated American victory. And then there were the people from the Congo, including a young man named Ota Benga, whose story would intersect with the Bronx Zoo in ways that still disturb us today. These living exhibits were designed to illustrate what scientists of the era called human evolution. At the time, many influential anthropologists believed that human races represented different stages of development. White Europeans stood at the peak of civilization. Other peoples represented earlier, more primitive stages. The fair's organizers arranged their exhibits to demonstrate this supposed hierarchy, placing the people they considered most primitive at one end and the most civilized at the other. The living exhibits were enormously popular. Visitors crowded around to watch people in traditional dress perform daily activities. They gawked at unfamiliar ceremonies and customs. They formed opinions about which groups were more advanced and which were hopelessly backward. The fair succeeded in its goal of shaping public attitudes about race and civilization. Among those who brought people to the fair was a man named Samuel Phillips Verner, a former Presbyterian missionary and self-styled African explorer. Verner had connections to the fair's organizers and to the scientific establishment. He traveled to King Leopold's Congo Free State with a specific mission. He was to acquire Mbuti people for the anthropology department. To understand Ota Benga's story, we must understand where he came from. The Congo Free State was not actually a colony of Belgium. It was the personal property of King Leopold II, who had acquired the territory through a series of cynical diplomatic maneuvers. Leopold presented himself to the world as a humanitarian, claiming that his goal was to bring civilization and Christianity to the Congo. The reality was one of the most brutal regimes in human history. Leopold's agents imposed a system of forced labor on the Congolese population. Local peoples were required to harvest rubber and ivory for export. Those who failed to meet quotas were subject to horrifying punishments. Hands were cut off as proof that bullets had not been wasted. Villages were burned. Women and children were held hostage. Historians estimate that millions of Congolese people died under Leopold's rule. The Mbuti are a group of peoples who have lived in the equatorial forests of Central Africa for thousands of years. Europeans called them pygmies because of their relatively short stature. To scientists of the early 20th century, they represented an especially primitive form of humanity, supposedly closer to apes than to civilized Europeans. Ota Benga was born around 1883 in the Kasai River region of the Congo. He grew up in the forest, learning the hunting and gathering skills that his people had practiced for generations. As a young man, his teeth were filed to points, a common practice among his community that marked the transition to adulthood. The exact circumstances of Benga's early life are unclear because he left no written record of his own. What we know comes largely from Samuel Verner, whose accounts were inconsistent and self-serving. But we know that tragedy struck Benga's community. Forces associated with Leopold's regime raided his area. His wife and children were killed. Benga himself was enslaved. Verner purchased several Mbuti people from slave traders operating in the Congo. Among them was Ota Benga. Whether Benga had any real choice in accompanying Verner is doubtful. He was a man who had lost everything, purchased from slavers by a foreigner claiming to offer a better life. The power dynamics made true consent impossible. Benga and the other Mbuti people were transported to St. Louis, where they were put on display for the duration of the fair. Visitors sometimes numbered 20,000 in a single day. The Mbuti were made to perform dances and demonstrations. They were subjected to anthropological measurements and tests. They were photographed, studied, and gawked at by crowds who saw them as curiosities rather than human beings. When the fair ended, most of the people who had been exhibited were returned to their homes. But Benga's situation was more complicated. Verner claimed that Benga had chosen to stay in America. The truth is more difficult to determine. What is clear is that by 1906, Benga was living in New York, under Verner's care but with no clear place in American society. Verner was perpetually short of money. He needed somewhere to house Benga while he pursued various business schemes. He approached the American Museum of Natural History, which briefly displayed Benga alongside museum exhibits. Then Verner turned to the Bronx Zoo. The events of September 1906 represent one of the most disturbing episodes in the history of American public institutions. What happened at the Bronx Zoo that month forces us to confront the reality of how easily prejudice can be dressed up as science, how quickly institutions can abandon basic human dignity, and how important it is to have people willing to stand up against injustice. Samuel Verner approached zoo officials in late August or early September, looking for a place to house Ota Benga, while Verner traveled south on business. The zoo agreed to take him in. At first, Benga was given some freedom to roam the grounds. He helped care for animals and perform tasks around the zoo. He was treated as something between a guest and an employee, an ambiguous status that reflected his ambiguous position in American society. Benga seems to have initially enjoyed aspects of his time at the zoo. He formed a bond with an orangutan named Dohong, one of the great apes housed in the monkey house. He spent time observing the animals, perhaps finding in them companions more accepting than the humans who stared at him. But Hornaday and Grant saw an opportunity. They decided to create an exhibit featuring Benga in the monkey house, the building that housed the zoo's primate collection. Their stated justification was educational. They claimed they were showing visitors the relationship between humans and apes, demonstrating the scientific concepts of the day. In reality, they were treating a human being as an animal. Exhibit. The deliberate cruelty of the exhibit design reveals its true purpose. The floor of Benga's cage was scattered with bones, suggesting that he was a cannibal who ate human flesh. This was a lie. The Mbuti people were not cannibals. But the image served to dehumanize Benga, to make visitors see him as a savage beast rather than a human being. He was given a bow and arrow, enhancing the primitive image the zoo wanted to project. His filed teeth, which were a mark of cultural identity in his homeland, were presented as evidence of savagery. Everything about the exhibit was calculated to make visitors believe they were looking at something less than human. On September 8, 1906, visitors to the Bronx Zoo found something unprecedented. In a cage in the monkey house, they saw a young African man. He was displayed alongside an orangutan named Do Hong. The floor of the cage was scattered with bones, suggesting that Benga was a cannibal. He had been given a bow and arrow, enhancing the primitive image the zoo wanted to project. A sign on the cage provided information about the exhibit. Age, 23 years. Height, 4 feet 11 inches. Weight, 103 pounds. Brought from the Kasai River, Congo Free State, South Central Africa, by Dr. Samuel P. Werner. Exhibited each afternoon during September. The crowds came in enormous numbers. On some days, 40,000 people visited the zoo. Many of them came specifically to see the man in the monkey house. They pressed against the cage, jeering and mocking. They threw things. They made animal noises. They treated Benga exactly as the exhibit designers intended, as something less than fully human. Benga had his teeth filed to sharp points, a common practice among young men in his community. The zoo emphasized this as evidence of his savagery. They dressed him in animal skins. They encouraged him to shoot his bow at a target, reinforcing the image of primitive African life. The entire display was calculated to degrade and dehumanize. Newspaper coverage was sensational and largely approving. The New York Times ran headlines like "Bushman Shares a Cage with Bronx Park Apes." The article noted that few visitors seemed to object to seeing a human being displayed like an animal. The paper quoted Benga's height, weight, and place of origin as if he were a specimen rather than a person. But not everyone was willing to accept what was happening. Within days of the exhibit's debut, black ministers in New York began organizing protests. The Reverend James H. Gordon of the Howard Colored Orphan Asylum in Brooklyn became the leading voice against the display. Gordon understood immediately what was at stake. The exhibit was not merely an insult to Ota Benga as an individual. It was an attack on the humanity of all people of African descent. By displaying an African man in a cage with apes, the zoo was promoting the idea that black people were closer to animals than to white humans. This was the same ideology that had justified slavery, that continued to justify segregation and violence against black Americans. Gordon's statement to the press captured the essential moral issue. Our race, we think, is depressed enough without exhibiting one of us with the apes, he said. We think we are worthy of being considered human beings with souls. The ministers organized with remarkable speed. They formed a delegation that included clergymen and lawyers. They reached out to newspapers. They gathered signatures on petitions. In an era when black Americans faced systematic exclusion from political power, they used every tool available to fight injustice. Other ministers joined the protest. The Reverend Robert Stewart MacArthur of Calvary Baptist Church declared that the person responsible for the exhibit degraded himself as much as he degraded Benga. Instead of making a beast of this little fellow, MacArthur said, he should be put in school for the development of such powers as God gave to him. MacArthur pointed out the hypocrisy of sending missionaries to Africa while treating Africans in America with such contempt. We send our missionaries to Africa to Christianize the people, he observed, and then we bring one here to brutalize him. A delegation of black clergymen and lawyers petitioned Mayor George B. McClellan Jr. for Benga's release. They argued that the exhibit was an affront to human dignity and an insult to the African American community. They demanded that the city intervene to end this shameful spectacle. Hornaday's response revealed the depth of his prejudice. In letters to the mayor and others, he dismissed the minister's objections as notoriety-seeking rather than an attempt to address a real grievance. He and Grant insisted that the zoo should not appear to be dictated to by black clergymen. They saw the protest as an attack on their authority and their scientific mission. The zoo initially resisted ending the exhibit, but the protests intensified, drawing national and even international attention. Louisiana newspapers denounced what they called a northern outrage, pointing out the hypocrisy of a city that prided itself on its progressivism engaging in such behavior. Even some white progressives began expressing discomfort. After about 3 weeks, the zoo finally closed the exhibit. Hornaday later described the episode as merely an amusing passage in the zoo's history. He showed no remorse, no recognition that anything wrong had occurred. To him, the protests were simply an annoyance that had interfered with legitimate scientific education. But there was another development happening in New York that would eventually help America move beyond the ideology that produced the Ota Benga exhibit. Just a few miles from the Bronx Zoo, at Columbia University, a professor named Franz Boas was leading an intellectual revolution in how Americans thought about race and culture. Boas was a Jewish refugee from Germany who had fled anti-Semitism. He brought to America a different approach to understanding human difference. Where scientists like Grant and McGee saw permanent racial hierarchies, Boas saw culture. Where they saw biology determining destiny, Boas saw environment and history shaping human societies. Boas trained a generation of anthropologists who would challenge the racist assumptions of their era. His students, many of them women and members of minority groups, developed new methods for studying human cultures. They demonstrated that what earlier scientists had called racial characteristics were actually cultural practices that could change over time. The battle between Grant's followers and Boas's students would play out for decades. In the short term, Grant's views prevailed. His book became a bestseller. His immigration restrictions became law. His ideas influenced Nazi Germany. But in the long term, Boas won. By the mid-20th century, the scientific consensus had shifted. The racial hierarchies that Grant considered obvious, facts came to be recognized as pseudoscience and prejudice. Ota Benga was released from the Bronx Zoo, but his troubles were far from over. The protests had made him famous, and that fame would follow him for the rest of his life. He could not walk down a street without people pointing and staring. The man who had been displayed as a curiosity remained one even after the cage doors opened. Reverend Gordon arranged for Benga to stay at the Howard Colored Orphan Asylum in Brooklyn, where Gordon served as superintendent. For 3 years, Benga lived there and at a satellite facility on Long Island. He was cared for, clothed, and given some education, but he remained a curiosity, a man whose very existence seemed to challenge how Americans thought about race and humanity. The orphanage environment was not ideal for an adult man who had lived his entire life in the forests of Central Africa. Benga struggled to adapt to institutional life. The press continued to seek him out. His story remained in the news, even in a relatively protected environment. He could not escape the attention that the zoo exhibit had brought. Gordon tried to find a better situation. He reached out to contacts who might be able to help Benga build an independent life. Eventually, a solution emerged from an unexpected quarter. In 1910, Gordon arranged for Benga to move to Lynchburg, Virginia. There, he would live with the family of Gregory W. Hayes, president of the Virginia Theological Seminary and College, a Black Baptist institution. Hayes and others in Lynchburg's Black community had followed the protests against Benga's exhibition. They felt a responsibility to help a man who had been so wronged. Benga's arrival in Lynchburg marked the beginning of a new chapter. For the first time since leaving the Congo, he had the opportunity to build something resembling a normal life. The community that received him was determined to treat him as a human being worthy of dignity and respect. Several people played important roles in Benga's Lynchburg years. Anne Spencer, a poet who would later become a significant figure in the Harlem Renaissance, tutored him in English. She approached him as a student worthy of education, not as a specimen to be studied. Her patience and respect helped Benga make progress in his new language. Benga's teeth were capped so that his filed points would be less conspicuous. This was meant to help him fit into local society, to remove the physical feature that had been most emphasized in the zoo exhibit. Whether Benga wanted this alteration to his body is unclear, but the intention was to help him move past the spectacle that had defined his time in New York. He was given American-style clothes. He enrolled in elementary school at the Baptist Seminary, sitting alongside children many years younger than himself, but approaching his studies with determination. He adopted the name Ota Benga and began working at a local tobacco factory. For several years, Benga seemed to be adapting. He made friends among the factory workers, who called him Bingo and treated him as a colleague. He went hunting in the Virginia woods, a skill from his homeland that connected him to his past while providing recreation in his new environment. He began saving money, hoping eventually to pay for passage back to Africa. There were signs of happiness. Benga smiled more often. He joked with friends. He participated in community activities. The people of Lynchburg who had welcomed him saw a man gradually healing from terrible wounds. But trauma does not disappear simply because circumstances improve. Benga carried within him the weight of everything he had lost. His family murdered in the Congo. His freedom stripped away by slavers. His humanity denied by scientists and crowds who saw him as less than human. Years of being treated as a specimen rather than a person. Then World War I broke out in 1914. The war disrupted transatlantic shipping, making it impossible for Benga to return home. The dream he had been working toward, the possibility of seeing his homeland again, was suddenly cut off. Benga sank into depression. The isolation he felt, even surrounded by people who cared about him, became unbearable. He could not go home. He could never truly belong in America. The trauma of everything he had experienced accumulated until he could no longer bear it. On March 20th, 1916, Ota Benga obtained a revolver and ended his own life. He was approximately 33 years old. He died far from his home, in a country that had never treated him as fully human. The news of his death barely made ripples. A brief mention in the New York Times. Some coverage in Virginia papers. The man who had drawn tens of thousands of spectators to the Bronx Zoo passed from the world almost unnoticed. Those who had exploited him moved on with their lives. Those who had tried to help him mourned quietly. The exhibit of Ota Benga was not an aberration. It was a logical expression of the ideology that shaped the Bronx Zoo from its founding. To understand how an institution dedicated to conservation could commit such an act, we must examine the ideas that drove its founders and the broader scientific establishment of their era. Madison Grant was not merely a conservationist with unfortunate racial views. He was one of the most influential racist thinkers in American history. His work shaped policies that caused immense suffering and influenced movements that committed genocide. Understanding his ideology is essential to understanding what the Bronx Zoo represented. In 1916, the same year Ota Benga died, Grant published a book that would shape racial ideology for decades to come. The Passing of the Great Race, or the racial basis of European history, argued that what Grant called the Nordic race was biologically and culturally superior to all other human groups. He claimed that America's greatness had been built by Nordic peoples, and that immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe was degrading the nation's racial stock. He advocated for strict immigration limits, forced sterilization of those he considered unfit, and laws against interracial marriage. Grant's book became enormously influential. Former President Theodore Roosevelt praised it. Politicians cited it as justification for immigration restrictions. Scientists at major universities treated it as serious scholarship. In 1924, Congress passed the Immigration Act, establishing quotas that severely limited immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe while essentially banning immigration from Asia. Grant's ideas had become law. The book also found admirers overseas. Adolf Hitler reportedly called The Passing of the Great Race his Bible. Nazi theorists drew on Grant's work as they developed their own racial ideology. During the Nuremberg trials, after World War II, defense attorneys for Nazi war criminals introduced passages from Grant's book as evidence that Genocidal ideas had originated in America, not Germany. The connection between American eugenics and Nazi policies was direct and documented. American eugenic laws served as models for Nazi programs. German scientists visited American institutions to study their methods. The forced sterilization programs that began in American states provided templates for Nazi policies. When the Nazis implemented their racial programs, they could and did point to American precedents. Henry Fairfield Osborn, who served as vice president of the New York Zoological Society and worked closely with Grant, wrote the preface to The Passing of the Great Race. In it, Osborn warned that the greatest danger threatening America was the dying out of hereditary traits among Nordic peoples, and their replacement by traits of less noble character. Osborn was a prominent scientist whose endorsement lent credibility to Grant's pseudo-scientific claims. Grant and Osborn were founding members of the American Eugenics Society, established in 1926. They used their positions at the zoo and at the American Museum of Natural History to promote their ideology. They funded research designed to prove racial differences. They lobbied for laws restricting immigration and mandating sterilization. The connection between conservation and eugenics was not coincidental. Grant saw both movements as expressions of the same underlying principle. Just as wildlife managers protected superior specimens and culled inferior ones, human society should protect superior racial stock and prevent its contamination. The same paternalistic impulse that drove him to save the bison drove him to advocate for racial purity. William Hornaday shared these views. He saw Native Americans, immigrants, and people of color as threats to American wildlife and American society. His conservation work was shaped by assumptions about who belonged in America and who did not. The man who saved the bison also displayed a human being in a cage. This ideology was not limited to a few eccentric individuals. It was mainstream science at the time. Major universities taught eugenics. Prestigious journals published eugenic research. State governments passed laws requiring sterilization of people deemed unfit. Between 1909 and the 1960s, at least 60,000 Americans were forcibly sterilized under these laws. Many of the victims were people of color, poor people, and people with disabilities. The Bronx Zoo was both a product and a promoter of these ideas. Its founders used the institution to advance their racial ideology. They saw no contradiction between their conservation work and their beliefs about human hierarchy. To them, both were expressions of enlightened scientific management. For more than a century, the story of Ota Benga remained largely unknown to the general public. The Bronx Zoo continued to grow and prosper. It became one of the most visited attractions in New York City. It pioneered conservation programs that saved numerous species. It educated millions of visitors about wildlife and the natural world. But the history did not disappear. Scholars uncovered documents. Writers told the story. Activists demanded accountability. Slowly, the full picture of what had happened began to emerge. In 1992, Phillips Werner Bradford, grandson of Samuel Werner, co-authored a book about Ota Benga. The book attempted to portray Benga and Werner as friends who had shared adventures together. Scholars were skeptical. Pamela Newkirk, a journalism professor at New York University, began her own investigation. Newkirk spent years researching in archives, tracking down documents, and piecing together the true story. Her 2015 book, Spectacle: The Astonishing Life of Ota Benga, presented a devastating account of what had really happened. Far from a friendship between equals, the relationship between Werner and Benga was one of exploitation and abuse. Benga had not chosen to come to America. He had been purchased, exhibited, and abandoned. Newkirk's research also revealed the full extent of Hornaday's racism. Letters between zoo officials showed their contempt for the black ministers who protested Benga's exhibition. Documents demonstrated that the display was designed specifically to dehumanize and degrade. The amateur passage Hornaday later described had been a calculated campaign of racist spectacle. In June 2020, amid nationwide protests following the killing of George Floyd by Minneapolis police, the Wildlife Conservation Society finally issued a formal apology. The statement acknowledged the treatment of Ota Benga and condemned the exhibit as disgraceful. It apologized for the eugenics-based, pseudo-scientific racism promoted by Madison Grant and Henry Fairfield Osborne. It committed to confronting the organization's role in promoting racial injustice. The apology was significant, but also, critics noted, more than a century late. Harvey Bloom, co-author of the 1992 book about Benga, told journalists that the apology was too little and too late. And to whom was this apology? He asked. It's a little late for Ota. The Wildlife Conservation Society made its archives related to Benga available online. Researchers can now examine the letters, photographs, and documents that tell this story. The organization committed to ensuring that social, racial, and environmental justice would be deep-rooted in its conservation mission going forward. Yet questions remain. How should institutions reckon with troubling histories? What does accountability look like when those responsible are long dead? How do we honor the victims of historical injustice while still recognizing genuine achievements? The Bronx Zoo did pioneering conservation work. The bison restoration alone saved a species from extinction. Countless other animals survived because of programs developed there. The scientific research conducted at the zoo advanced our understanding of wildlife and ecosystems. These achievements were real and important, but they cannot be separated from the ideology that shaped them. The same men who saved the bison also exhibited a human being in a cage. The same institution that educated millions about wildlife also promoted racist pseudoscience. Conservation and eugenics were intertwined from the beginning. What can we learn from this history? What does the story of Ota Benga and the Bronx Zoo teach us about institutions, ideology, and human dignity? First, we learn that scientific authority can mask profound moral failures. Grant, Hornaday, and their colleagues presented their views as objective science. They claimed to be following evidence wherever it led. In reality, they were using the prestige of science to justify their prejudices. The supposed objectivity of their research was a facade covering deep-seated racism. This pattern continues today. People still invoke scientific authority to justify hierarchies and exclusions. Recognizing how science has been misused in the past helps us identify similar misuse in the present. Critical examination of who funds research, who conducts it, and whose interests it serves remains essential. Second, we learn that good intentions do not guarantee good outcomes. Grant and Hornaday genuinely believed they were improving America. They saw themselves as enlightened leaders protecting valuable resources from ignorant masses. Their conservation work was motivated by real concern for wildlife and natural beauty. But intentions alone are insufficient. Actions matter more than motives. The men who saved the bison also caused immense harm to human beings. Their genuine achievements in conservation cannot excuse their dehumanization of Ota Benga. We must judge institutions and individuals by the full range of their impacts, not just the outcomes they intended. Third, we learn the importance of protest and dissent. The black ministers who demanded Benga's release were voices crying in the wilderness. Most white Americans either approved of the exhibit or remained indifferent. Newspapers mocked the protesters. Zoo officials dismissed them as publicity seekers. Yet the ministers persisted. They organized, petitioned, and spoke out. They forced the zoo to close the exhibit. They arranged for Benga's care afterward. They could not undo all the damage, but they prevented it from continuing. Their example reminds us that speaking truth to power matters, even when immediate victory seems impossible. Fourth, we learn that institutions can change. The Bronx Zoo of today is not the institution of 1906. Its current leadership has acknowledged past wrongs and committed to doing better. It supports conservation programs around the world that work with indigenous communities rather than against them. It promotes environmental justice alongside wildlife protection. This transformation was not automatic. It required activists who demanded accountability, scholars who documented the truth, and leaders willing to confront uncomfortable history. Institutions change when people push them to change. The arc of institutional history bends toward justice only when human hands bend it. Finally, we learn that history has consequences. The ideas promoted by Grant and Hornaday did not disappear when they died. Their influence shaped immigration policy, inspired Nazi genocide, and contributed to ongoing racial inequality. The casual racism that allowed tens of thousands of New Yorkers to gawk at a man in a cage persists in subtler forms today. Understanding this history helps us recognize its ongoing effects. The racial hierarchies invented in the 19th century continue to shape how people are treated in the 21st. Confronting the past is essential to changing the present. The Bronx Zoo still stands. More than 125 years after its founding, it remains one of the world's premier zoological institutions. Millions of visitors pass through its gates each year. Children press their faces against glass to watch tigers and gorillas. Scientists conduct research that helps save endangered species. The grounds are beautiful, the exhibits impressive, the educational programs extensive. If you visit today, you will not find any reference to Ota Benga in the monkey house. The building itself has been renamed and renovated multiple times. The cage where Benga was displayed no longer exists. Nothing on the grounds commemorates what happened there in September 1906. But elsewhere in the Bronx, a plaque now marks Benga's story. Historical markers in Lynchburg, Virginia, remember his years there and his tragic death. Books, documentaries, and academic studies have brought his story to wider attention. Ota Benga is no longer forgotten. The bison that Hornaday bred still roam American prairies. The conservation movement he helped build still protects wildlife. The zoo he designed still educates and inspires. These achievements endure. So too does the shadow of what was done in the name of science and civilization. Every institution carries its history forward, whether acknowledged or not. The choices made by founders shape what comes after. We cannot escape the past, but we can choose how to reckon with it. The Bronx Zoo's story is America's story, a nation built by people who achieved remarkable things and committed terrible wrongs, often at the same time. A society that proclaimed liberty while practicing slavery, that welcomed immigrants while discriminating against them, that celebrated progress while destroying ancient ways of life. Understanding this complexity is not about assigning guilt or demanding purity. It is about seeing clearly, about recognizing that the institutions we inherit were shaped by people who were both better and worse than we might wish, about taking responsibility for what we do with that inheritance. The question of how to handle troubled institutional histories remains contested. Some argue that acknowledging past wrongs is sufficient. Others demand more substantial forms of accountability, including renaming buildings, removing statues, and restructuring organizations. Still others worry that focusing on historical injustices distracts from present challenges. The Bronx Zoo has tried to navigate this terrain. Its apology in 2020 was a step toward accountability. Making archival materials available to researchers allows scholars to study this history in detail. Committing to social and environmental justice as core values represents an attempt to build on the past, rather than simply apologize for it. But questions remain unanswered. How should the zoo commemorate Ota Benga on its grounds? Should there be a memorial at the site of the monkey house? How can the institution teach this history to the millions of families who visit each year without overwhelming their experience? What responsibilities do today's zoo leaders have for wrongs committed more than a century ago? These questions have no easy answers, but asking them is essential. Institutions that refuse to confront their histories are doomed to repeat their mistakes. Only by understanding how science was misused in the past can we guard against similar misuse today. Only by acknowledging who was harmed can we begin to address those harms. The gates of the Bronx Zoo remain open. Visitors still come by the millions. The question is not whether we should tear down what those troubled founders built, but what we should build upon it. How we can honor genuine achievements while confronting genuine wrongs. How we can create institutions worthy of all the people they serve. Ota Benga's story forces us to ask what kind of zoo, what kind of city, what kind of country we want to become. The answer lies not in the past, but in the choices we make today. If you found this story meaningful, please like, subscribe, and share it with others who care about understanding the full truth of our history. In the comments below, tell me which institution's hidden history you would like me to explore next. Your engagement makes these investigations possible. Thank you for joining me on this difficult but necessary journey into America's past.